No justice, no peace. Breonna Taylor. Friends, I'm feeling concerned about our freedom. There is a lot happening in this nation without my consent. I do not consent for police to assault and kill Black and brown bodies while hiding behind qualified immunity. This week has been just another turn on the 2020 roller coaster. My surge capacity is depleted, and I'm trying to find ways to refill that particular bucket in the uncertain length of this pandemic. I know that we still have more time and trauma to come. Healing while bracing for the next hit is scary and ineffective, as many of us already know. A previous turn on the roller coaster left me flailing, looking for something to hold on to. I've reached for community, and I also reached toward books, which are a luxury for a working parent of two. I committed to read all the works of Brené Brown because, well, I'd been meaning to get around to it anyway, and I needed a concrete and attainable project to focus on. In the first chapter of the first book I read, Miss Brown talks about writing herself permission slips as a way of setting intention. It's a great story, and I won't ruin it for those of you who have not read it. But I tried it out, and I think it works. This week I gave myself permission to rewrite the Serenity Prayer, and I'm going to share my version with you as we begin this sermon. Goddess, grant me the strength to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I replaced God with goddess and serenity with strength. It works for me. It's a drop in my bucket. Strength, courage, and wisdom. Amen. Earlier today, we completely steamrolled over lovable, furry old Grover. I've read that book at least 100 times with my kids. I even have an interactive app on my phone. And I think it was last week while Bryce was playing for it and I prepared for this sermon that I was suddenly horrified by the obvious disrespect for Grover's boundaries. Grover did not consent, not once. And we took liberties, turned pages, and made it to the monster at the end of the book. We violated Grover's boundaries, and Grover gaslit us in the end. Good story. Now, I recognize that we want our kids to face their fears, but given the relationship they have with Grover in this book, I think it's safe to say that we've got some reparation and recovenanting work to do. Kids love that story because they have the power to turn the page, the freedom to override his protests, and let's face it, kids don't get that freedom or power over another very often. When they do, I've seen them do cruel, mean-spirited, harmful, irresponsible things, and also occasionally loving things. Their freedoms are few, and they are expected to ask permission all the time. COVID-19 has limited our freedom across the age spectrum, and while kids are more adaptable and flexible in the face of that limitation, adults like myself are very agitated when our freedoms are limited. I know that I've done cruel, mean-spirited, harmful, and irresponsible things under stress. The debate about public safety and wearing masks is just one situation that highlights this truth. Some folks are me-firsting and others are us-togethering, and we are all failing the group project. Perhaps we need yet another reminder that when our individual freedom bumps edges with another's, we need to stop, collaborate, and listen. Privilege expects the freedom not to ask permission. At some point on the transition from child to adult, we stopped asking if we could ride our bike around the block, eat cake for breakfast, and started taking on the responsibility of deciding how to acquire, allocate, and spend our own resources and time. This is great fun, especially if we live in a vacuum without the presence of others and their freedoms. But where there are two or more gathered, there are boundaries to our freedom. There is tension between freedom and consent. It's about power, who has it and when. Power over or power with. We all have power, even if we're not taught to use it, or we are abused in ways that make it seem as though our power has been taken away. Extreme power holder and privilege holder Mark Zuckerberg said, "Freedom means that you don't have to ask permission first." And as a female, assault survivor, OWL facilitator, educator, and parent, well, I have to say that explains an awful lot about what goes on Facebook. It sounded a lot like another adage I've heard a lot over my lifetime. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Brené Brown teaches that boundaries are our access point to connection. In our relationship and sexuality curricula our whole lives, we teach bodily autonomy from birth. Young kids are taught that their bodies belong to them and that they are the boss of their own bodies. We discuss good touch and bad touch. We introduce the idea of consent as a way to empower these young humans in the safekeeping of their own body. We teach them that they have the freedom to choose how they connect with others, and that they also have to ask for consent as well. It's a give and receive expectation, the foundation of relationship and mutual respect, and they get it. I've known 5-year-olds who understand consent better than some 74-year-old men. It's simple and it's nuanced and complex and it's necessary. There is freedom and deep internal power in knowing about consent and boundaries from an early age. Boundaries keep us safe and they give us freedom. As my friend Amelia Norfleet Dorn, fellow OWL instructor and friend, told me, nothing is richer or sweeter than meeting at a place of consent. And enthusiastic consent, well, that's a life-giving, creative force of nature, as Reverend Moran has shared from the First Unitarian pulpit. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. It makes my insides squirm because I have used this statement in the past to justify means to an end or outcome that I wanted. Is it really easier? I wonder. It might be more efficient, but also more harmful in a me-first sort of way. I think of how the basic concept of consent, my body, my choice, has been co-opted from a statement made about female reproductive rights to a statement of entitlement about choosing to not wear face masks as a public health protection. There is tension between public calls for freedom and my individual call to build consent culture in my family, congregation, and community. We are confused about freedom, and many of us have been led to believe that freedom is the end-all, be-all embodiment of free will and choice, the absence of oppression of any and all sorts, and is the ultimate goal of our venerated democratic experiment here in the United States. I love freedom, and ultimate freedom for all is anarchy. Here, our aim is peace, liberty, and justice for all, named in our 6th principle. If freedom and consent had a child, it would be named liberty. Liberty is freedom within a system of laws, agreements, and expectations that we consent to be governed by. To underscore this, I took a look at our nation's founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. In these documents, freedom shows up twice. The word free shows up 11 times. The word liberty shows up 5 times, and consent shows up 15 times. Consent is not at all a new idea, and yet fear shows up when self-proclaimed patriots are reminded that their freedoms must play nicely in the yard with the rest of our freedoms. No one exists in a vacuum. In our beloved democracy, individual freedom is boundaried by the freedom of others. In tough times, our boundaries are ragged and raw with exposed nerves. Without a common understanding of these boundaries, chaos erupts. Pain, trauma, and abuse thrive in places where boundaries are torn, disregarded, and ignored. When consent is absent, so is the freedom and liberty that we proclaim to love. Amelia also shared this wisdom. We try to keep consent imprisoned in the context of sexuality to keep it taboo, but consent has to do with everything we ever do. Consent strikes fear in the heart of privilege because it implies power, relationship, agreements, whether implicit or explicit, that have the possibility of limiting our beloved freedom. Consent can be easy or it can be very hard work. But what if, like Grover's story, we are the monsters at the end of our own book? What of the consent and permission that we can give ourselves? Could we begin there? Permission to set boundaries and hold them. Permission to honor boundaries we encounter with compassion, to listen. Permission to find one safe place and then extend it. Permission to feel feelings. Permission to connect when we'd like to. I'm here today to give you permission to give yourself permission, even and especially now during hard times when so many things are happening without our explicit consent. Permission to do things out of order. to feel fear and do the thing anyway, permission to laugh at fear, to fail spectacularly, to live every remaining day of your life on your terms, to begin, to end, to say no, and yes, and explore the full menu of options before you decide, to move at your own pace, march to your own drum, and dance like no one is watching. Permission granted. And then extend that permission to those around you. They can set boundaries as well. Peace, liberty, and justice for all. None of us are free until all of us are free, and we must be explicit about who has been left out of all. Black lives deserve liberty and justice. Brown lives, immigrant and refugee lives, queer lives, trans lives, non-binary lives, all deserve liberty and justice and abundant peace. Goddess, grant me the strength to accept the things that I cannot change, and the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Strength, courage, and wisdom. May we each find our one safe place and then widen the circle to include peace, liberty, and justice for all. And if you're confused about a boundary, ask. Let it absolutely be so.